somewhere in the high desert of eastern California, at an elevation where the wind never truly stops and snow can fall during any month of the year. There is a town the state of California officially describes as being in a state of arrested decay. Not restored, not preserved. Arrested, as if the decay itself had been caught mid-action, doing something it wasn't supposed to be doing. And frozen there, mid-motion, still reaching. The town's name is Bodie. Between 1877 and 1882, it was home to somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 people, depending on which census taker you believed. And the census takers in Bodie often didn't last long enough to finish their counts. In those 5 years, the Bodie morgue processed more bodies per capita than any other settlement in California. The town had 1 church and 65 saloons. It had a red light district that operated 24 hours a day. It had a Chinatown, a Maiden Lane, a brewery, a slaughterhouse, a bank vault robbed so many times that the lock was eventually welded shut instead of replaced. And it had a reputation, spread from San Francisco to Sacramento to the mining camps of Nevada, for being the kind of place where a man could arrive on Monday and be in the ground by Friday without anyone filing a report. Some of that reputation was exaggeration. Mining towns always cultivated a mythology of violence because violence attracted a particular kind of man, and those men spent money. But some of it, the parts that weren't written in newspapers, the parts recorded only in coroners' logbooks and in private letters from men who left Bodie quickly and never went back. Some of it was worse than the reputation suggested. Things happened in Bodie that the official record buried, not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient. Things that connected men of influence in ways those men could not afford to have connected. What we know today about Bodie is largely what was permitted to survive. Before we continue with the story of Bodie and what it actually cost to build, break and bury, take a moment right now to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And while you're there, drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We read every single one. Tonight, we want to know who's out there in the dark with us. Now let us go back to the beginning. Not the beginning from the tourist brochures, but the real one. The one that started not with gold, but with a man named Waterman Bodie, a blizzard, and a decision that should never have been made. The eastern Sierra Nevada in the late 1850s was not a place that invited settlement. The mountains rise abruptly from the Great Basin, and the terrain between them, the high desert valleys, the alkali flats, the volcanic tablelands, has a quality of hostility that early settlers often described not as dangerous but as indifferent. The land didn't want to kill you. It simply didn't care whether you lived or died. And in that indifference, it killed many. The elevation at which Bodie would eventually sit, 300 feet above sea level, in the volcanic highlands east of the main Sierra Nevada crest, meant that the seasons, there were not the seasons men from eastern states or Europe recognized. Winter arrived not in December, but in October, sometimes September. It did not depart until May, sometimes June. Snow did not come gently. It came sideways, driven by winds that crossed hundreds of miles of open desert, before reaching the highlands with nothing left to stop them. The temperature in January could fall to 30 below zero Fahrenheit, before accounting for wind. There was no shelter in the landscape itself, no deep forests, no sheltering valleys. The terrain was high, flat, and open. Whatever lived or tried to live there did so in full exposure to whatever the sky decided to do. The Paiute people had lived in that region for centuries and understood its rhythms. Where water could be found in summer, where game moved in winter. How to read the sky when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in an afternoon without warning. They called the volcanic highlands east of the Sierra by names that translated roughly to the place of difficult passage and where the wind has no mercy. These were not poetic designations. They were practical ones. The Paiute moved through this country with the knowledge of people who had learned over many generations which parts could sustain life and which could not, and on what schedule and at what cost. They knew, for instance, that the highland basin where Bodie would eventually stand was not a place to winter. They knew it because their ancestors had tried, and the ancestors had told their descendants what trying had cost. The men who arrived in the 1850s looking for gold did not speak Paiute, and most would not have listened if they had. William Bodie, the man whose name would eventually, through misspelling and misremembering, become the name of one of California's most notorious towns, arrived in the Mono Lake region in the summer of 1859. He was a prospector from Poughkeepsie, New York, which is to say a man who had spent most of his adult life chasing something just over the next ridge. He had been in California since 1849, following the original rush, and by 1859 he was 41 years old, trail-worn, and running low on both capital and patience. He had tried the rivers of the Mother Lode, the gravel bars of the American River, the Feather River, and the Trinity. He had worked for wages in the hydraulic operations of the Northern Sierra, saved enough to strike out on his own again, then lost those savings on a claim that yielded nothing, and started again. Men like Bodie were the majority of California's mining population by the late 1850s, not the ones who had struck it rich in E49 and become legends, but the ones who had followed the legend and found only the diminishing returns of a rush already past its peak. They were patient in the way men become patient when their alternatives are worse. He had partners, as most prospectors did, men whose names the historical record treated with less care than bodies, meaning they were remembered incompletely and then forgotten. One was a man called Black Taylor, who may or may not have been born into slavery and freed before reaching California, depending on which account you trusted. Another was a French-Canadian whose name appears in some records as Doré and in others simply as the Frenchman. Both men were experienced in the rough mechanics of high country prospecting, placer panning in summer streams, assessment of quartz outcroppings, calculation of whether a promising sign justified the cost and labor of following it deeper. In late July of 1859, Bodie, Taylor, and Doré discovered placer gold in a ravine in the highlands about 80 miles north of Mono Lake. The amount was not spectacular, enough to confirm a vein, not enough to make anyone rich immediately, but in the exhausted arithmetic of late-stage California prospecting, it was enough to matter. The color in the pan was consistent. The rock formation suggested something below the surface that the surface samples couldn't fully reveal. In the language of the trade, it was a showing, a reason to look further. Bodie recorded the claim. He sent word south. He began making plans. He did not survive to execute them. In November of 1859, Bodie and a companion named Esk, a younger man recently arrived from Ohio, who had attached himself to the party in the summer and proven himself willing, if not particularly skilled, set out from their winter camp to retrieve supplies from a settlement in the valley below. They had put off the journey longer than they should have, waiting for a break in the weather that came briefly and then closed again before they reached safety. A storm came in from the north faster than either man anticipated. Esk survived by finding shelter in a stand of pinyon pines and building a fire from the deadfall around him, feeding it through the night while the wind brought the temperature down to levels that made breathing painful. Bodie did not. He was found the following spring, frozen, less than half a mile from camp. He had made it nearly far enough. The camp was visible from where they found him. A fact everyone who subsequently told the story noted, because it had the quality of things that are true and terrible, rather than simply terrible. He was buried near the discovery site in an unmarked grave. His partners misspelled his name in the claim documents. Whether by accident or carelessness, had the same effect as intention. And the place became Bodie rather than Bodie. A slight and meaningless distortion that somehow felt appropriate for a town that would spend the next 20 years distorting everything it touched. For almost 2 decades after Bodie's death, the claims in the Highlands changed hands multiple times without yielding anything significant. Small operations came and went. Men staked, dug, gave up, moved on. The land around the original discovery site remained largely unworked. Its deeper veins untouched, sitting quietly beneath a few feet of volcanic soil, while the men who might have found it chose easier country. The winters drove most operators out. The cost of supplying an operation at that elevation on roads impassable for 5 months of the year made the margins on low, grade, or impossible. The Standard Mine Company, incorporated in San Francisco in the early 1870s, by men whose primary expertise was financial rather than geological, maintained a small crew on the property, but without serious expectation of return. It was the kind of investment wealthy men made when they had money to lose and a theory about what the rock might contain, understanding that most such theories proved wrong and hoping this one would prove otherwise. Then, in 1876, a mine shaft collapsed. The Standard Mine's operations in the years before the collapse had included a series of exploratory shafts driven into the hillside at various angles and depths. Following what the company's geological advisor, a man from San Francisco who visited twice a year and spent the rest of his time in an office, believed were the most promising structural indicators. One of those shafts, the eastern one, had been driven deeper than the others, deeper than the budget had originally authorized, because the foreman on site, a practical man named Gideon Fahey from Ohio, who had 30 years of mining experience and no interest in the financial theories of men in San Francisco offices, had a feeling. That feeling was based on the color of the rock, the angle of the quartz intrusions, and the way the temperature dropped as you went deeper, which experienced miners used as an indicator of particular geological conditions associated in that part of the Sierra with high-grade ore. Fahey's feeling turned out to be correct. The collapse of the eastern shaft in the autumn of 1876, a collapse that killed 2 men, a fact noted in the company's records and not dwelled upon, exposed in the rubble a vein of gold-bearing quartz that assayed at values that made the company's owners go pale when they read the report. Not pale with fear, pale with the particular shock of sudden, almost incomprehensible wealth. The assay numbers were checked twice, because numbers like that were the kind that happened in stories, not in the accounts of working mines in the California high desert. The numbers were confirmed. By the spring of 1877, the word was out and the men began to arrive. In 1878, Bodie had a population of somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 people, growing by hundreds per month. The Standard Mine and the Bodie Mine were producing ore at rates that justified every superlative the San Francisco papers could manufacture. The Bodie Bank processed more gold dust in a single week that spring than some counties processed in a year. The town's commercial district on Main Street extended nearly half a mile, with wooden storefronts pressed so tightly together that a fire at one end would have consumed everything before a man could run to the other. They had 2 fires in 1878. Neither was the last. The town itself had the quality of a place that had grown faster than its bones could support. Streets existed because men walked through the same mud, often enough that the mud developed ruts. The ruts became roads, and the roads attracted buildings on either side without any plan or logic. Town water arrived from a spring on the hillside, through a pipe that froze solid every winter. So between November and March, the town got its water from snow packed into barrels and melted near stoves. A process both laborious and ineffective, since the barrels were rarely clean and the snow was rarely free of whatever the wind deposited in it during its crossing of the volcanic flats to the east. The sanitation arrangements were what a man who had lived in any established eastern city would have described, charitably, as provisional. In summer, the smell from the alleys behind the commercial district carried as far as the residential areas on the hill, and men who had grown up in places with sewers wrote home to their families describing Bodie in terms their families did not always believe, because the descriptions were too extreme to seem credible. The violence in Bodie during its peak years was not merely anecdotal. It was structural. The town had more than 60 establishments selling alcohol, an opium trade, a gambling economy, and a floating population of men with no stake in the community's future, because they did not expect to remain long enough to have one. The justice system, such as it was, consisted of a sheriff whose jurisdiction was technically Mono County, but who was physically located 30 miles away in Bridgeport. A town marshal replaced 8 times in 4 years, for reasons ranging from corruption to incompetence to death, and a justice of the peace who held court in a room above a saloon, whose rulings were occasionally enforced and occasionally not, depending largely on whether the defendant had friends better armed than the plaintiff's friends. To live in Bodie in 1878 was to exist in a condition of continuous low-level alarm. The sounds of the town at night, and the town had no real night, because the saloons ran until dawn and the mills ran around the clock, their stamps pounding ore in a rhythm that those who lived in Bodie long enough stopped hearing, the way people stop hearing a clock in a room they've occupied too long. Included, with a regularity that ceased to be remarkable, gunshots, sometimes distant, sometimes close, sometimes followed by shouting, by boots on wooden floors, by that particular silence that follows sudden violence in a space full of men deciding whether to involve themselves or not. But the newspapers of the era, both local and in San Francisco, covered Bodie's violence with something that looked at a distance like horror, but was actually closer to commercial enthusiasm. Stories of shootings sold papers. Stories of robberies sold papers. The town had developed a reputation, cultivated, exaggerated, but rooted in enough truth to sustain itself as California's most dangerous settlement, a designation that attracted a particular kind of man and repelled the kind of families that might have stabilized it. The particular story of a man named Patrick Fahey, which circulated through the California press in the summer of 1879, sold a great many papers and then, with unusual speed, stopped being mentioned at all. Patrick Fahey was 34 years old in 1879. He had come to Bodie from Virginia City, Nevada, where he had worked as a shift supervisor in the Comstock mines long enough to save a sum of money. He then lost in a speculation he ever after refused to discuss in detail. He arrived in Bodie in the spring of 1878 with nothing but his tools, his experience, and a reputation among mining men as someone who understood geology with almost uncommon precision. The kind of man who could look at a rock face and describe what it was doing 50 feet beyond where the candle reached. He was, by the accounts of the few people who knew him in Bodie and later spoke about him, a quiet and private man. He did not frequent the saloons except occasionally when the cold was particularly bad and the rooming house insufficiently warm. He did not gamble. He attended no church, by which in 1878 Bodie meant he attended the same institution as the majority of its residents. He was Irish, born in County Clare, raised in Philadelphia, shaped by the particular combination of Catholic sensibility and American practicality that characterized the generation of Irish American men who had come of age in the decade after the famine. He was a man who took notes. This was unusual enough among mining men that his colleagues remarked on it. He carried a leather-bound notebook, small enough to fit in his coat pocket, thick enough to hold months of observations. He used it constantly, recording the dimensions of rock faces, the angle of ore intrusions, the temperature and air quality at different depths of shafts, and the discrepancies he noticed between what he observed and what the official maps of the mine's workings depicted. The discrepancies were, at first, what geologists would call normal. Minor variations between the idealized picture a map represents and the actual irregular reality of rock under the earth. Rock does not follow lines, or does not conform to the angles engineers draw. A certain amount of divergence between map and reality was expected and unremarkable. But the discrepancy Fahey found in the late summer of 1879 was not the ordinary kind. He hired on at the Standard Mine, and within 6 months he was a shift foreman, significant advancement for a man without local connections. His supervisors, particularly the mine superintendent, a man named Calvin Pratt, who had come west from Pennsylvania with a degree in mining engineering from a school that no longer exists, and who managed the Standard's operations with a combination of technical competence and political sophistication that kept San Francisco's investors satisfied and Bodie's miners from organizing, recognized Fahey's practical knowledge and used it. Fahey knew where the ore was. He had a gift for it that Pratt, for all his formal education, could not replicate. The problem was that Fahey also knew other things. In the early autumn of 1879, Fahey wrote a letter, which has survived partially, because a portion was entered into a county proceeding that was itself only partially preserved, in which he described what he had discovered in the lower levels of the Standard Mine's eastern shaft. He did not describe it clearly, which may have been deliberate caution, or simply reflect that he did not yet fully understand what he had found. But what he described, in the language of a man choosing his words with the deliberateness of someone who understood they might be read by hostile eyes, was evidence that ore samples from a particular section of the mine had been systematically underreported. Not by accident, not by ordinary slippage of record, keeping in a busy operation, but systematically, deliberately, in a pattern that, if Fahey's interpretation was correct, had been running for at least 2 years and had diverted a significant and as yet uncalculated sum from the mine's public shareholders to persons unknown. The letter was addressed to a lawyer in San Francisco named Emmett Corcoran, who represented a consortium of investors holding shares in the Standard Mine. Corcoran received it. We know this because he later said so in a deposition, but he did not immediately act on it. His explanation for the delay was that he wanted to verify the claims before bringing them to his clients. Patrick Fahey did not give him time to verify anything. On the night of October 14, 1879, Fahey was found dead in the alley behind the Occidental Hotel on Main Street. The alley was one of the narrow service passages behind the commercial buildings, used during the day by delivery men and at night by men who preferred not to use front entrances, whose front entrances implied a kind of public commitment they weren't prepared to make. It was dark. The town had no gas lighting in the alleys, and the light from the saloon windows on Main Street did not reach around corners. The cold that night was the particular cold of an October in the eastern Sierra, which sits in the lungs differently than the cold of lower elevations. Drier, sharper, smelling of nothing, which is its own kind of wrongness. The official finding was that he had been shot during a robbery. His wallet and his watch were missing. The town marshal at the time, a man named Rufus Strand, opened an inquiry, but that inquiry produced no arrests and was formally closed within 3 weeks. The San Francisco papers ran the story for 2 days, then ran nothing. What they did not run, what no paper ran at the time, although several journalists later claimed to have been aware of it, was the fact that Patrick Fahey had not been carrying his wallet that night. His landlady, a widow named Agnes Corrigan, who ran the rooming house on Fuller Street, where Fahey had boarded for 14 months, told the inquest that Fahey had left his wallet in his room that evening, because he had told her he was only walking to the assay office and back. She had seen him go. She had noted, as landladies note things about the men in their care, that he had seemed preoccupied. Not frightened, she said, but the way a man seems when he is carrying something in his mind that is too large to set down. He carried nothing but his notebook, the small leather, bound notebook for his geological observations, which, unlike the wallet and watch, was never found. That notebook is the detail that keeps appearing at the edges of this story, mentioned and then abandoned, the way a name keeps surfacing in a document not supposed to contain it. Corrigan told the inquest about it. The inquest noted her testimony and moved on. Corcoran, the San Francisco lawyer, mentioned it in his deposition and then clarified, when pressed, that he had never seen its contents and could not speak to its significance. A mine worker named Thomas Healy, who had been Fahey's closest associate at the Standard and had been present at the Eastern Shaft the day Fahey made his discovery, testified before the same inquest that he too had seen Fahey take notes in that notebook on the day in question. Healy left Bodie 3 months after the inquest, went to Oregon, and according to a letter he sent Corrigan. After that, the record of Thomas Healy ends. The notebook was never found. The inquiry was closed. The Standard mine continued operating, and in the spring of 1880, Calvin Pratt, the mine's superintendent, Fahey's superior, the man with the engineering degree, purchased in cash a substantial house in San Francisco's Nob Hill neighborhood. The purchase price was recorded in public property records. It was a number that did not align easily with a superintendent's salary, even a generous one. No one asked him about it publicly. No one seems to have asked him about it at all. The years between 1880 and 1882 were Bodie's apex. The Standard mine alone produced millions in gold during those 2 years, and the town that had grown around it reached what contemporaries called its fullest and most terrible flower. A phrase used by a Methodist minister named Elias Drummond, who arrived in Bodie in the summer of 1880 to establish a congregation and spent most of the next year writing letters home to his bishop that grew progressively more desperate in tone. Drummond's letters have survived in their entirety in the archives of the Methodist Episcopal Church. They constitute, inadvertently, one of the most vivid first-person accounts of Bodie at its peak. Not because Drummond was a particularly skilled observer, but because he was genuinely shocked by what he saw and had not yet learned to moderate his shock for an audience. He described the streets at night as a continuous corridor of noise and ruin, in which the light from 60 doorways makes a kind of counterfeit noon, and men pass through it in states of intoxication so profound that they appear to be navigating not a street, but some internal landscape of which the rest of us can have no conception. He described the cemetery on the hill above town, Boot Hill, though he refused to use that name, as filling at a rate that troubled him not only morally but practically. There was, he wrote in October 1880, beginning to be a problem of space. He was not wrong. The Bodie cemetery records, which are more complete than most of the town's surviving documents, list 273 burials between 1877 and 1882. Of those, 61 were attributed to gunshot wounds, 49 ruled homicides, 12 classified as accidents. Another 37 were attributed to mining accidents. 18 were attributed to freezing, which in the context of the era meant any death from exposure to extreme winter conditions, temperatures regularly below zero, winds that blew men off their horses. 23 were attributed to illness, a category covering everything from pneumonia to the various symptoms that in the 1880s traveled under the name fever, without further specification. The remaining, a category the record keeper simply labeled cause undetermined, numbered 41. 41 people buried in Bodie between 1877 and 1882, whose cause of death was listed as undetermined, lost in a town where the coroner was also the town dentist and the town's most active gambling parlor operator, and where the coroner's official seal appears on documents that sometimes contradict each other about the same event. Undetermined could mean many things. It could mean what it said. It could mean the death had been determined, but the determination was inconvenient. It could mean no one with authority had looked carefully enough to form an opinion. Among the 41 was a man named Dario Lucchetti. Lucchetti was Italian, born in the Piedmont region, arrived in California in 1875, spent 2 years in hydraulic mining operations in the northern Sierra before coming south to Bodie in 1877. He was a laborer, not a skilled miner, which meant he did the physical work of breaking and hauling rock, rather than the technical work of assessing and directing it. He worked for the Bodie mine, not the Standard, and his employment records there are among the more complete surviving documents from the period. The Bodie mine kept better books than its competitor, for reasons likely having as much to do with legal caution as administrative virtue. Lucchetti appears in those records as a reliable and uncomplaining worker who received periodic wage increases and never filed a grievance. He also appears, and this is where his story becomes less ordinary, in the private account book of a man named Samuel Obergefell, a merchant who operated a dry goods store on King Street and who maintained, in addition to his business ledger, a second, smaller notebook in which he recorded personal debts, favors, and what he called, in his ornate mid-century German script, matters of weight. Obergefell's second notebook was discovered in 1923 in the back room of a building in Bridgeport, California, by a woman clearing out property that had belonged to her deceased uncle. She gave it to a local historian, who transcribed portions before the original was lost. Those transcriptions are held today in the collection of the Eastern California Museum in Independence. In September of 1881, Obergefell's notebook records a conversation with Lucchetti. The entry is brief. Obergefell was not a man who wrote at length about uncomfortable things, but its contents are specific. Lucchetti had told him something about the Bodie mine's lower tunnels, and something Obergefell describes only as the matter concerning the Chinese workers and the passage they were made to use. The Bodie mine, like many California mining operations of the period, employed a significant number of Chinese laborers. The Chinese workers in Bodie occupied a separate neighborhood, Chinatown, on the town's southeastern edge, and within the mine, they were assigned the most physically dangerous work, the tunnels with the worst air, the lowest ceilings, the most unstable walls. This was not unusual for the era, nor illegal under California law at the time, though several labor organizations had argued for years that it should be. What Lucchetti told Obergefell, apparently, was something more specific than the general conditions of Chinese labor in the Bodie mine. He told him about a particular passage, a particular use of a particular passage. Whatever that use was, it troubled Lucchetti enough that he told Obergfell, and it troubled Obergfell enough that he wrote it down in his private notebook under matters of weight, and then evidently did nothing about it. The next entry concerning Lucchetti simply records his death. Dario Lucchetti was found dead on the morning of March 3, 1882, at the bottom of a shaft in the Bodie mine's eastern section. The shaft was one he was not assigned to work. The foreman's report states that he must have wandered into the area by accident in pre-dawn darkness. The shift began before sunrise in winter and fallen. The depth of the shaft was sufficient to ensure the fall itself caused death. The coroner's determination was accidental death. It was recorded as undetermined in the cemetery records, which may indicate a clerical error or may indicate something else, but the discrepancy was never investigated. Obergfell noted it in his private book. He wrote, "Lucchetti is dead. The matter he described is now, I think, beyond my ability to pursue. I will say no more of it here. He never did. The decline of Bodie did not happen all at once. It happened the way all such declines happen, in phases, each of which felt, to those living through it, like a temporary setback rather than the beginning of an end. The ore grades at the Standard and Bodie mines began dropping in 1882. Not precipitously, but gradually. The way a tide goes out, so slowly, you don't notice it's gone until you're standing in mud. The mill runs that had been producing $20 of gold per ton dropped to 15, then to 12, then to numbers that made the accountants in San Francisco begin asking questions the men in Bodie did not want to answer. By 1883, the population had dropped by half. By 1885, it had dropped by half again. The saloons began closing, not all at once, but one by one, the highest, rent ones first, the ones on the edges next. The Chinese laborers, who had no financial stake in the town, and no reason to stay once the work dried up, left in organized groups for San Francisco and Sacramento. The red light district contracted to a single street, and then to a handful of houses operating quietly without ceremony. The Bank of Bodie closed in 1884, taking with it whatever records it had kept on the financial movements of the mine companies and their officers. Calvin Pratt, the Standard Mine superintendent, had already been gone for 2 years by then. He resigned in the fall of 1882, citing personal considerations, and returned to his Nob Hill house in San Francisco, where he lived comfortably for the rest of his long life. He gave an interview to the San Francisco Chronicle in 1891 on the occasion of his appointment to the board of a new Nevada mining concern, in which he described his years in Bodie as formative and challenging in ways that built character. The interviewer asked about the town's violence. He said it had been exaggerated. The interviewer asked about the Standard Mine's production records. He said they had been exemplary. The interviewer did not ask about Patrick Fahey. The interview was published on a Sunday. It was, by all accounts, well received. Emmett Drummond, the Methodist minister, left Bodie in the spring of 1883. He went to a congregation in Stockton, then to one in Sacramento. In his final years of active ministry, he gave several lectures on mining town morality that were notable for what they omitted. He spoke at length about drinking, gambling, violence in abstract terms. He never mentioned Patrick Fahey. He never mentioned Dario Lucchetti. He never mentioned the specific content of the conversations he had recorded in his own private correspondence, which he appears to have burned before his death in 1909. Agnes Corrigan, Fahey's landlady, stayed in Bodie longer than most. She converted her rooming house into a boarding house and then, as the population shrank, into a private residence. She is listed in the 1890 census as one of fewer than 300 people still resident in Bodie. She died there in 1897. in a town that had by then shrunk to a skeleton. A few dozen holdouts, a mine or two still producing fitfully. The buildings already beginning to show what would become their characteristic quality of preserved collapse. She left upon her death a small collection of personal effects and a letter addressed to no one and sealed with wax. The letter was found among her things by the man hired to clear the property, a drifter named Cole Renner, who had arrived in Bodie looking for winter work and stayed 6 months. Renner could read, which placed him in a minority among men doing that kind of labor. And he read the letter before deciding what to do with it. What he did with it, ultimately, was give it to a woman in Bridgeport named Ida Sargent, the wife of the Mono County recorder, who had taken an interest in collecting documents from the declining settlements of the region. Sargent held the letter for many years and showed it to several people without making its contents widely known. After her death, it passed to her daughter, and after the daughter's death, to a historical collection. But which collection is a matter of some confusion, because the letter appears in 2 separate inventories from the early 20th century, and in neither inventory after 1931. The contents of the letter, as described by the people who read it before it disappeared, were as follows. Agnes Corrigan wrote that in the weeks before Patrick Fahey's death, he had told her something she had not repeated at the inquest, because she was afraid, and she was writing it down now because she was old and there was no one left to be afraid of. Fahey, she wrote, had found in the lower levels of the Standard Mine's eastern shaft a secondary passage, unmarked, not appearing on any official map of the mine's workings, that connected to a section of the mine's infrastructure, designated on internal company documents as an ore processing auxiliary. He had followed this passage and discovered that the auxiliary was not an ore processing facility at all, but a storage space, a large, reinforced chamber, containing machinery. Fahey, with his extensive mining knowledge, identified as equipment for the systematic segregation and diversion of high-grade ore before it reached the mill. In plain terms, a skimming operation. High-grade ore was being pulled from the rock before it was weighed and recorded, diverted through the secondary passage, processed separately, and its value recorded nowhere in the company's official books. The gold it produced went somewhere. The Standard Mine's shareholders, many of them ordinary investors in San Francisco who had bought shares on the public exchange, never saw it. Fahey had found this. He had measured it, estimated its scale, recorded his findings in his notebook. He had written to Corcoran, the lawyer. 3 weeks later, he was shot in an alley, and the notebook was never found. Corrigan did not name the men she believed responsible. She said only that Fahey had told her the operation could not have been maintained without the knowledge and cooperation of several people, whose names he had not given her because he did not want her in danger. She said she had lived the 17 years since his death with the weight of that knowledge, and she was tired of carrying it. The letter ended, "I do not know if this will reach anyone who will do something with it. I suspect it will not. Things like this have a way of becoming old news before they become no news. But I have written it. That is the only thing left I could do." The fire of 1892 destroyed most of what remained of Bodie's commercial district. It started in a building on Green Street in the early morning hours of a July day, in conditions of low humidity and high wind that made it effectively unstoppable once it reached adjacent structures. 63 buildings burned. The town's population was small enough by then that everyone who wanted to watch did so from a safe distance, and no one died. A different kind of miracle than the miracles Bodie had been accustomed to in its prime. What burned in 1892 included the office of the Bodie Free Press, the town's newspaper during the peak years, which had accumulated a library of back issues, correspondence, and unpublished materials. All of it was gone by morning. The editor at the time, an elderly man named Frank Overton, who had been running the paper for 15 years on local inertia and personal stubbornness, told the Bridgeport Chronicle that he had lost, among other things, a file of documents he had been intending to do something with. He did not specify what the documents were. He was asked, and he said only that they were things that had been sent to me over the years by people who wanted something done, and then thought better of wanting it. He was 71 years old. He died the following winter. Whatever he had intended to do with those documents went with him. The fire of 1892 is documented. The fire of 1932, which destroyed a second substantial portion of the town, is also documented. That fire was determined to have started in a building housing the equipment of the last remaining mining operation, an outfit called the Rosecliff Company, which had been attempting to extract value from old tailings using a cyanide leaching process. New technology for the era, and in the hands of undercapitalized men working in the wrong season, dangerous technology as well. The Rosecliff fire burned for 2 days. It destroyed several buildings that had survived the 1892 fire, including the old assay office and the remains of the structure that had been the Standard Mines administrative headquarters. A historian from Berkeley named Marcus Aldrich, who had been studying Bodie since the mid-1920s and had visited multiple times to photograph and catalog surviving structures, wrote in a letter to a colleague that the 1932 fire had destroyed several items he had previously identified as potentially significant, including, he mentioned with a particularity suggesting he had thought carefully about his words, the contents of a locked room in the Standard building that I had been unable to gain access to, and that the owners had refused to allow me to examine. Aldrich's letter is held in the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley, as part of a collection of his research materials. The letter is dated 6 weeks after the 1932 fire. The locked room he described is not mentioned in any other document associated with the Bodie historic site. By the 1940s, Bodie had dwindled to fewer than 20 people. The last full-time residents left around 1942, driven out by wartime labor demands and the simple math of a town with no economic reason left to exist. The buildings remained. The wind kept moving through them. The winters kept doing what winters at 300 feet always do, settling into the wood, working at the foundations, finding the cracks. The state of California designated Bodie a state historic park in 1962. The official designation uses the phrase, arrested decay, to describe the preservation philosophy. The buildings are maintained in the condition they were found, allowed to continue their slow deterioration, without restoration, stabilized against collapse but not renewed. It is, when you think about it, an unusual approach to preservation. The acknowledgement that something is falling apart, combined with the decision to let it keep falling apart, just more slowly. The Standard Mines eastern shaft, the one where Patrick Fahey made his discovery in 1879, is not part of the state park's accessible area. It is listed in the park's internal documentation as structurally unsafe for visitation and is fenced off. Park rangers who have worked at Bodie for extended periods and have spoken on background, not for attribution, not officially, have mentioned that the eastern shaft's closure predates any formal structural assessment and that they are not aware of any inspection having been conducted to determine the shaft's actual condition. The secondary passage Fahey described in his letter to Corcoran, the unmarked passage, the one connecting to the chamber with the skimming equipment, does not appear on any map of the mine's workings in the state park's possession. This could mean many things. Maps from 19th century mining operations are notoriously incomplete. Passages were dug and not recorded. Records were lost in fires. It could mean all of those things. The chamber Corrigan described, reinforced, large, housing machinery, would have required significant construction. It would have left physical evidence. Stone and timber don't disappear the way paper does. But no one with the authority to look has looked, just when you think you understand what Bodie was. A boomtown, a cautionary tale, a place where greed, violence, and desperation ran together, as they always did in the mining West. The story reveals another layer. If this is giving you chills, share this video with someone who loves dark history. Hit the like button to keep this channel going, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this. What happened in those tunnels is only part of what we still need to uncover, because the standard mine story did not end with Calvin Pratt's departure or Patrick Fahey's death. It had a coda, and the coda involves a man who came to Bodie in 1938, nearly 60 years after Fahey's murder, and left without publishing what he found, and who, when asked about it in the final years of his life, gave answers that were never quite answers. His name was Bernard Holt, and he was a journalist from Sacramento. Not a famous one, not the kind whose name appears in histories of the profession, but the kind who spent 30 years writing for regional papers, knew how to find a story, and knew also when a story was bigger than he was. He came to Bodie in the summer of 1938, as part of a project his paper had commissioned on the ghost towns of the California interior, and spent 3 weeks there. Longer than the assignment required, staying in a tent at the edge of the town site, because the buildings were already considered unsafe for habitation. What he did during those 3 weeks, we know primarily from 2 sources: the article he published, which was thorough and accomplished, and said nothing remarkable, and a notebook he kept, which was not published, and was found among his papers when he died in 1971. His daughter, settling his estate, found the notebook and read it. Because she was a careful woman who had grown up watching her father choose his words, she recognized that it was different from his other notebooks. More careful, more deliberate, written, she later said, as if he thought someone might eventually read it who wasn't supposed to. Holt had found the secondary passage. Not the passage itself. The physical shaft had partially collapsed by 1938, and the section Fahey had accessed was inaccessible. But something else, a set of documents wedged into the wall of the Standard Mine's old administrative office, behind a section of paneling that had partially detached. The documents were damaged by moisture and age, but legible in their substance. They were internal company memoranda, written in the 1880s, discussing what the writer, whose identity Holt said he could not definitively establish, but who was almost certainly the mine superintendent, based on the authority the writer claimed, called the secondary accounting. The secondary accounting was exactly what Corrigan's letter had suggested Fahey found. A parallel record of ore extraction and processing, maintained separately from the official books, recording the movement of high-grade material from the eastern shaft through an unmarked passage to a separate processing facility. The memoranda were not confessional. They were administrative. They discussed quantities, schedules, personnel arrangements. They discussed the men who operated the secondary facility and what they were paid for their silence. They discussed what happened when the arrangement was threatened. They did not use Patrick Fahey's name. They used a construction that Holt, in his notebook, transcribed with a directness, suggesting he had no doubt about its meaning. The matter of the employee who had been conducting unauthorized surveys of the eastern section. and in a subsequent document, the resolution of the employee matter. The resolution. As if Fahey's death were a budget line, as if a man's murder were an administrative outcome. Holt's notebook records that he spent 2 days after finding the documents in a state of what he called something between fear and calculation. He was aware, he wrote this explicitly, that the men who had authorized the resolution were dead. Pratt had died in 1914. The other names in the documents, the men who had managed the secondary operation on the ground, had died in the years between. There was no living criminal to expose. There was no case to make to a prosecutor. There was only the history, the fact of what had happened, the mechanism by which a man had been killed and his discovery buried. The 40 years during which the Standard Mining Company had continued to operate and its officers had continued to prosper, and the shareholders who had been defrauded had never known they were being defrauded. What Holt calculated in those 2 days was whether publishing that history served a purpose proportionate to the risks of publishing it. The men were dead, but they had families. The Standard Mine had been absorbed into other entities, which had been absorbed into others still. The way mining concerns always move capital through successive corporate containers. There were people. He did not name them in the notebook, who had a financial or reputational interest in the matter remaining buried. And there were people in positions of authority, again unnamed, who he had reason to believe would prefer that the story not be told. He published the Ghost Town article. It was well received. It said nothing about the documents. He took the documents with him when he left Bodie. He kept them for 33 years until his death. His daughter found them with the notebook. She read them. She put them back. She told one historian, in a conversation in 1979, that she had decided to let my father's decision stand because he lived with it longer than I have, and he knew things I don't. She died in 1994. The documents and the notebook were part of his estate, which was handled by an attorney whose records are not publicly accessible. Whether the documents survive and in whose possession is not known. What is known, what the documented record, partial and fragmented as it is, allows us to say with confidence, is this: Patrick Fahey found something in the Standard Mine's eastern shaft in 1879 that threatened powerful men. 3 weeks later he was dead. The notebook in which he recorded his findings was never recovered. The men responsible for his death died wealthy and respected. The company that employed them continued operating for decades. The fires of 1892 and 1932 destroyed much of what remained of the administrative record. A journalist found evidence of the fraud in 1938 and chose not to publish it. That evidence passed out of public reach and has not been seen since. And beneath Bodie, in the eastern section of the Standard Mine, in a shaft that has never been formally assessed for structural safety, the stated reason for its closure. There is a passage that appears on no official map. It is still there. The rock doesn't burn. Today, Bodie receives approximately 200,000 visitors a year. They walk the wooden boardwalks of a town that stopped in 1942 and has been stopping ever since, slowly, incrementally. In the way things stop when no one decides to stop them, but no one decides to maintain them either. The Standard Mine headframe still stands on the hill above town. You can see it from the main road as you approach. Rising against the eastern Sierra sky, with that particular silhouette mining infrastructure, has functional, angular, stripped of any attempt at beauty. The park's interpretive materials describe Bodie's history in terms of boom and bust, human ambition and natural forces, a town that rose quickly and fell just as quickly, leaving a lesson about the transience of wealth. The materials mention the violence in measured terms, noting the high death rates, the 65 saloons, the reputation that kept respectable families away. They mention several of the documented killings, the famous ones, the ones that made the papers and became part of the town's mythology. They do not mention Patrick Fahey. They do not mention Dario Lucetti. They do not mention the 41 people buried in the Bodie cemetery because undetermined. There is a docent program at the state park, staffed by volunteers who know Bodie's history with an intimacy that comes from years of study. Several of them, in conversations with researchers and journalists over the decades, have mentioned that requests to have the eastern shaft professionally assessed have been met with what one longtime volunteer described careful as a lack of urgency that I find hard to attribute entirely to budget constraints. The state of California maintains Bodie in arrested decay. The phrase is apt in ways that may not have been fully intended. Decay arrested, caught in the act, stopped before it could complete itself, held in a condition of permanent incompleteness, where the ending is always approaching but never arrives. The buildings lean. The wind works through the gaps. In winter, when the tourists are gone, the roads impassable, and the town returns to the silence it had in the decades before anyone arrived looking for gold. The only sounds are what the wind makes and what the settling timber makes as the cold contracts it, and the structures remember, in whatever way structures can remember, what they once contained. The standard mine headframe stands above it all. It has been standing for 140 years, through fires, winters, and the slow departure of everything and everyone that once gave it a reason to stand. Below it, the eastern shaft descends into the dark. The passage goes where it goes. The chamber at the end of it, if it is still there, holds what it holds. Some things, once buried, resist excavation not because they are unreachable, but because the people with the power to reach them have decided, generation by generation, that the cost of what they might find is greater than the cost of leaving it where it is. Patrick Fahey knew something. He tried to tell someone. He died for trying. That is not a ghost story. Ghosts are comfortable. Ghosts are things we can dismiss in daylight. This is something else. The record, partial, damaged, interrupted at every critical juncture by fires and disappearances and the deliberate choices of men who understood exactly what they were doing when they chose silence. This is the shape of what happened when wealth was large enough, men ruthless enough, and institutions compliant enough that a murder could be wrapped in the ordinary paperwork of a mining town and left there to yellow for a century and a half. Bodie did not refuse to stay dead. Bodie was never allowed to be fully alive, not in the sense of the full accounting, the complete record, the unredacted version of what happened in those shafts, in those back rooms, in that alley behind the Occidental Hotel on the night of October 14th, 1879. The town is still there. The shaft is still closed. The passage appears on no map, and somewhere, in a collection, in an estate, in a box, in a room no one has opened since 1994, there are documents a man spent 33 years deciding not to publish, and a notebook in which he wrote down everything he found and everything he feared. This mystery shows us something we would prefer not to know about the past, that the mechanisms of concealment were not exceptional, but ordinary, not the work of unusual evil, but of ordinary self-interest operating in conditions where no one with power had any reason to object. What do you think really happened in that eastern shaft? Do you believe everything about Bodie has been told, or is there a version of this story no one has been permitted to tell? Leave your comment below. But if you enjoyed this and want more stories like it, stories where the horror is real, because the people were real and the choices they made were the choices people actually made, subscribe. Hit the notification bell and share this with someone who thinks they know American history. There are always rooms we haven't looked in yet. We'll see you in the next one.